All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Scott McMahon. I'm the Executive Director for the Greater Minnesota Partnership and a Senior Lobbyist with the law firm of Flaherty and Hood, where I do work on behalf of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. I want to thank you for joining us today for the kickoff for our Housing Advocacy Week. We appreciate you taking the time to join us for the next half an hour as we talk through kind of what's going on in housing in Greater Minnesota, some of the policy ideas that we have going forward, just an opportunity to think through and chat about, the realities of what we're seeing on the ground in our communities and where hopefully we can go moving forward. I want to take this opportunity to welcome Chad Adams to the conversation. Chad is not a stranger to the coalition, having spent a number of years as the city administrator in Albert Lea. For the past couple of years has been the president and CEO of the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership. So we're glad that Chad is able to join us today. A couple of pointers for the meeting here. We do want this to be interactive, and so as Chad and I are talking, feel free if you have a question to throw it into the chat. I'll be monitoring that as we move through, and so I'll interject those questions that you post into Chad's and my conversation. With that, I'm hoping that we can talk about 15 minutes or so and then really dive into your questions. So I encourage you all, if you have anything that's top of mind, to throw it in there. So I do also want to highlight that we have, in addition to this being the kickoff for Housing Week, we do have a commentary piece that you'll hopefully see popping up in your local papers within the course of the next week, authored by Mayor Holmer from Thief River Falls and Shane Zutz, the VP for Human Resources with DigiKey. A good perspective on the community business relationship between housing and how do we build our workforce and have the housing we need for folks. And then we also have a hearing on one of our bills tomorrow in the Senate Housing Finance and Policy Committee at 1 o'clock tomorrow, and that'll be streamed online via the Senate website. So if you're interested in seeing what's going on in that conversation, you can log in at 1 o'clock and see us presenting on behalf of the Workforce Housing Grant Program. So with that, we will kick things off here. Chad, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, thanks, Scott. Great to join you here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Well, we appreciate you joining us. As we kick off here, I know there's a number of folks online who are well familiar with the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership. But for those of us from Northern Minnesota, if you want to take a chance to kind of let us know, what the organization is about and what you do on a daily basis.
Sure. Yeah. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit community development corporation, and we're one of a few of those in the state of Minnesota. Our mission is to create thriving places to live, grow, and work by partnering with communities we serve. So we really have that emphasis on connecting with communities and trying to find solutions primarily in the housing industry. We cover a region of about 30 counties in Southwest and South Central Minnesota. We've got offices in Slayton and Mankato, Minnesota. We're best known probably for providing a full continuum of housing services across the entire spectrum, including housing counseling, home ownership, education. We have a construction department that provides some project management for both residential and commercial projects, sometimes contracting specifically with communities or cities. We provide some temporary building official services. If you ever have a gap, for example, we can come in and help provide some of those temporary services. We do lower door testing, which is required on all single family homes, new construction throughout the state of Minnesota. And we also do some community development that might include some community engagement, some grant writing, other forums, or housing implementation plans. And specifically, I want to mention that's not a housing study, but we're looking at trying to create a product that might kind of meet that balance. We also develop and build and own single family, multifamily developments. And do property management as well too. We own about 60 multifamily apartment complexes in our region that represents over 2,000 units. So we're very familiar with everything in the housing industry and funding and such, and certainly willing to have a conversation with the community as well too, just to discuss your needs or any issues you might be having with housing.
Great. So, Chad, you come to this conversation with two great lenses. I think, obviously, from the work you're doing with the partnership, as well as your past work with the city. So, for a real softball question to kick things off here, as briefly as possible, in your view, what is the housing issue in Greater Minnesota?
I know, Scott, you're probably gonna not be surprised by this, but it's not can't really be justified and answered briefly. But certainly, I want to mention that there's so many different issues, and I'm having several community contacts a week on just housing alone, and also testifying on a variety of bills this legislative session on behalf of the Homes for All Coalition, our partnership, and also just Greater Minnesota in general. I would say probably the biggest issue that I'm speaking to right now is really kind of the gap in the construction costs versus the ability for what residents can rent or actually pay through a mortgage to get that house or that product. It's really difficult for any builder or developer to build homes without substantial assistance right now with the community or a private entity, maybe it's a business in a community or other state and federal entities. And I think the handout that you provided to the group provides a great illustration of that. And I can provide a testimonial of a community that we just worked in where we built a single family home, listed it as $262,000 for a pretty modest slab on grade, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, two-car garage home. And we received an offering price of $267,000. What we're seeing for that type of product or hearing from communities who would love that product to be built between $150,000 and $200,000, we or other developers and builders just cannot make that work. So we're trying to come up with creative solutions to that, and some of that will be on policy, and some of that will be in terms of funding as well too. There's other issues such as multiple issues in lack of competition, lack of those in the trade industry, prevailing wages. Sometimes we would run into a little bit of an issue with, but we're trying to provide some workarounds, creative workarounds for that as best we can. The one thing that we're not seeing an issue with, which is I know is always a hot topic that I've testified on several times, is that city fees have not been the issue for us in Greater Minnesota. I talk to our construction department about that regularly. So if you need an additional voice on that, we provide pro forma analysis and workbooks, as we call them, to really show that fees have not been a substantial issue for us.
Chad, since you hit on it, I'm going to share my screen here real quick, and we can talk through those graphics that you were talking about a minute ago. So I hope everybody can see this okay. So these are some graphics that were worked up in the housing report that the Center for Rural Policy and Development put together a couple years ago. That, the numbers are probably a little bit different now, but the message, I think, is still spot on for what we're seeing. So this first one gives you a sense as to what we're seeing in the ground for building a home. So the first area is what that individual or that family is able to afford as far as the cost to build something new. And then the next part is what you have for the appraised value of the starter home once it's constructed. And then the third part is what the actual cost of the home is. And so, one of the challenges that we face in Greater Minnesota is, first of all, when you build the house, the minute you move into it, you've lost value in it because you can't sell it for what it costs you to build it. And then secondly, as you indicated, Chad, getting the financing from that standpoint is a real challenge. And this is where, a lot of the nonprofits and the government programs come into play because, the private sector isn't going to make the investment in funding a property if the value of that property as soon as it's built is less than what the inputs had to go into it. So that's always a challenge that we face. We see a similar situation in the multifamily side of the equation as well, where the median rents in our communities are significantly lower than what the rents that are needed to finance a project. And then the third area that we look at closely is, our existing housing stock and what's happening with it, and our ability to do improvements to the existing house to bring it up to, current kind of standard housing expectations. And we run into that same issue where the cost to purchase and rehab the substandard home is again more than what the home would be appraised for once the things are done. And so I think that, Chad, does that give a good summation as to kind of what you see in the marketplace on a daily basis with
Absolutely. Just about every community that we work with, we're seeing very similar metrics.
Okay. So, Chad, one of the things we hear a lot around the Capitol is affordable housing. And it seems that, the strong emphasis and policymaking around the Capitol is around the affordable housing question. Is that the right lens for us to be looking at it from Greater Minnesota? or from the affordable is affordable different in Greater Minnesota than the conversation we have in the Twin Cities?
I would say it's a little bit different, but there's still a great need. It's a very still substantial issue in Greater Minnesota. I probably oftentimes hear more the need for market rate housing and workforce housing versus affordable communities. But when we review housing studies, there's still a substantial gap in the affordable housing component in most communities, and also understand that a lot of Greater Minnesota communities have much more of a stronger need for rehab of owner-occupied homes right now. So there's probably a little bit more of a shift there where there's not been as much investment in Greater Minnesota due to lack of funding or tools to be able to meet that rehab need for not only single family homes, but also for multifamily homes as well too. We're seeing a lot of properties that were once financed by rural development 30 years ago that are coming out of their compliance period and are either looking at being converted into market rate housing or may fall out of that compliance and not be preserved as affordable housing. That's one of the things that we try to do is preserve that affordable housing in a lot of communities as well too, understanding that some communities also need that market rate housing. So those are kind of a couple snapshots that I would offer for comments there.
Okay. And just as a reminder to folks, we've had some join us since the conversation started. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll interject them into things as the conversation goes forward. So Chad, when we look at the different buckets that the state has for making investments that can help out with these issues, the two big ones we have are general fund appropriations into specific programs, and then bonding that comes primarily through the housing infrastructure bonds. Can you talk a little bit about how we use these different kind of programs in Greater Minnesota and what works and what doesn't?
And specifically, the housing infrastructure bonds work very well for us because we are typically a part of the super RFP process through Minnesota Housing each summer. And there's typically not enough funding that goes around. I think this last year, there are a little over 80 applications across the entirety of the state for funding, and only about 20 or 25 got funded through a combination of housing infrastructure bonds and tax credits. So pairing those two together provides a lot more opportunity, but you can still understand the great need that's out there and that still exists. We're also a strong advocate of the general obligation bonds for public housing, because we know there's a lot of public housing agencies that are needing to repair their facilities as well too. But in short, the HIBs provide a lot of leverage and flexibility for more housing projects in Greater Minnesota. We see the need for about $500 million on the next biennium for both HIBs and general obligation public infrastructure bonds. I'm also a co-chair of the Homes for All Coalition, which is a coalition of over 270 housing agencies throughout the state of Minnesota that are advocating together on housing policy. And that's kind of a number that we continue to identify.
Okay. So shifting gears a little bit here, obviously when we talk about housing, the primary target that we're thinking about is the family, and how do we make sure that we have homes for individuals and families in our communities. But there's also a significant role that housing plays with our workforce and our employers. Can you talk a little bit about what you're hearing from employers and kind of their take on their business operation, their ability to expand based off of what we have going on in Greater Minnesota on the housing side?
Yeah, and I would certainly state that there are extreme challenges. We're talking to a lot of small communities, whether that's under 1,000 population or even communities between 1,000 and 10,000 population, that have a lot of employers who are looking at adding 10 to 25 jobs in the next 18 months. Some we're very aware of are going to be adding hundreds of jobs over the next 5 years, and some need that housing right now or need that workforce right now, and there is no housing availability in those markets. So you're starting to see a lot of creative things that businesses are starting to do, and because we're a nonprofit and have a lot of relationships with other state and federal funders, we've got some unique opportunities to try to find some solutions. That doesn't mean that there aren't some unique solutions out there beyond working with an entity such as ourselves, because there certainly are, and would certainly just advocate for communities to continue to be flexible in your approach and try to get the employers at the table, because they're starting to find the need that they have to invest in workforce, and housing is one of the ways to do that.
So Chad, on that front, as you've had experience with successful partnerships and bringing different stakeholders together, putting on your lens as a former city administrator, what would you tell our city folks as to who they should be talking to, who they should have at the table. What's the magic recipe to make some things work in a community?
I think there are a lot of different funders, whether it's Minnesota Housing, DEED, obviously, Greater Minnesota Housing Fund, agencies such as ourselves. And again, I'm willing to have a conversation with the community just to kind of provide them maybe in some general direction without us being directly involved, just kind of part of our education component, our mission that we serve. But, I think cities have to continue to play a substantial role in being a partner. And whether that's more active partnerships in housing development through combination of infrastructure, tax abatement or TIF, lot cost write down, fee reductions, is really that short-term investment is going to make a lot of long-term gains for a community, particularly with trying to retrain and attack workforce as well too. And I recognize a lot of cities don't want to get into the housing business per se, but the private market, unfortunately, just has not been able to respond and keep up with the needs in Greater Minnesota over the last couple of decades. I'd also like to mention, for example, that Edina, even though it's not in Greater Minnesota, just recently partnered with the Met Council to acquire some homes for affordable housing. That was just recently, I think, in the Star Tribune here over this last weekend. So again, just try to keep a flexible mind and look at unique creative options to find the solution needed for your particular community.
Perfect. So we've got a couple of our participant questions I want to get into here. And so one of the things we're hearing more and more about are housing trust funds. Where do you see the role for this? How does it need to be structured? Do we need to be looking at state policy to do more in this front? Where do we need to go to make this be a better tool for us?
I think the housing trust funds are a great tool, and there might need to be some policy changes, centered around it. In addition to, I think, some paired funding from the state to kind of kick them off, I think would be great for communities to establish those. But when we're looking at working with communities, oftentimes they don't really have cash on hand or anything set aside for housing development. And as you know, when you apply for a lot of grants, they're always looking for some share of a city partnership, whether it's 10%, 15%. In some situations, it's, like the 2-for-1 on the workforce housing grant, which we could speak to differently or separately, because there's a great, extraordinary need for that particular product itself. But I'm a strong advocate of the local housing trust funds and in cities setting aside some dollars for housing development, whether that's affordable or workforce or market rate development.
So here's another one from one of our participants. Looking at the various MHFA programs, do you think there is a possibility or value in turning the MHFA programs into more of a block grant for communities to be able to meet their specific needs rather than trying to have specific statewide programs that are trying to address a problem here and here and here?
No, I haven't really thought about that very much, but I think it's a very valid question when we're looking at all the different housing programs and kind of the complexity and uniqueness for the programs in Minnesota Housing. There might be some value in trying to bring it together in a little more consolidated form like that. And I think that would probably help in terms of just the efficiency of getting grants or funding out there to particular communities, much more than what we're seeing now. Because when we're looking at like an affordable housing project, for example, that's about a 3-year investment for a developer to go through the project planning, to go through the application phase, and then the closing phase. So there's got to be some more rapid projects or products out there through the state that I think can really help Greater Minnesota specifically.
So we've got a question here that kind of gets into a little bit as to the CGMC policy initiatives of the year. So thank you for this upcoming question. Do we have new ideas for helping cities fund new infrastructure for single family subdivisions? And so, I think this is an opportunity for me to hit quickly on a couple of the things we're working on this session. If I can find this and share it again. The 3 bills that we're working on heavily, one is a fix-up fund to help us renovate existing homes and bring them up to 2021 standards. The third one here is the Greater Minnesota Workforce Housing Development Fund that we want to see more money get into it, and then also increase the project costs allocation from 25% up to 50% to kind of deal with that prevailing wage issue, Chad, that you hit on a little bit. But the third one gets to that question a little bit about, can we create a public infrastructure grant program to help cities pay for some of that infrastructure that needs to go in? This is a proposal that that's built off of the BDPI program that our cities are very familiar with, where cities could get state grants to cover the infrastructure that needs to go out to build new housing lots or new housing subdivisions. So Chad, you want to chat a little bit about your take on some of the things we're talking about and what impact they may have going forward.
Yeah, I think all those programs are very helpful, and we utilize, the two existing ones with the Fix Up Fund and the Workforce Housing Grant, which we're trying to work more with communities on. In the future, we've got some creative concepts that we're working on right now with that. Also, in addition to trying to advocate some change at the state level. But the public infrastructure grant, I think, would be a great one because there's not enough tools right now in the local toolbox to try to partner essentially with builders or developers out there. And I will echo what I stated earlier as well too. It's going to take probably a combination of different tools to actually get a large housing development or just housing development in general going in a particular community. You have to disrupt the market to some extent. And there's a lot of communities I know on the southern Minnesota corridor, the Austins, the Worthingtons, the Albert Lees, that have done just that and are a great model for utilizing tax abatement, but oftentimes need more assistance, whether that's lot cost or whether that's infrastructure assistance, such as this public infrastructure grant. Could be few reductions or other things as well too. So yeah, I think it would be a great asset to the toolbox.
Perfect. So a couple more participant questions here. One focusing in on multifamily housing for larger low-income families. We've got some communities that are seeing larger families with 5 or more kids coming in, and we don't always see the affordable housing development being built around families of that size. So are there things that we can do, or kind of what's your advice for city leaders who are trying to deal with that issue?
Certainly, again, I think through super RFP applications through Minnesota Housing, when you have a project that's going in at 24 units or plus, a substantial community partnership, and that could be the city, the county, could be other agencies and entities in that particular community. So to get all your stakeholders involved as best you can, that makes a very strong application in the eyes of the state when you have multiple partners, multiple funding sources. It's just becoming more and more critical all the time.
And then looking at city policy, can rezoning to allow secondary housing units help to alleviate housing shortages? And do you know of any cases in Minnesota, and I just lost my question here, in Minnesota where we have been used effectively to encourage housing development?
I know that Minneapolis has been looking at that. I'm not sure if there's very many other greater Minnesota cities that are doing just that, but I think that's one of the advantages that we've got. We can come in and help educate and provide some community engagement in a particular community. So have that community conversation up front before an actual zoning application comes in. That's going to help really diffuse a lot of maybe the NIMBY isms that you get out there. So I think there is opportunity for that, where there's been, light industrial properties that have been zoned where it might convert well into single family or multi-housing development, or there might be some single family zoning that could take upon some duplexes or a little bit larger density in the past. So I think there are some creative routes there where cities can make some progress too.
Great. So we do have about 5 minutes left in the conversation here. So if you have any last lingering questions, feel free to get them in the chat and we'll get them into the conversation here. But Chad, looking at the construction cost, obviously that's one of the big challenges we have. Do you see anything happening in the construction cost of a new home? Are there regulatory things that are driving the cost that maybe beyond labor and other items that should be looked at? Or is it simply the raw material that just got so expensive that that's what's driving that construction cost?
Yeah, I think most of it is the raw materials, and I'm in regular conversation with our construction department and other lumber yards and such, and we don't see the cost coming down anytime soon. We are looking at other creative options such as panelized construction, which would eliminate a little bit of the lumber component. Obviously, the steel framing, modular homes, we're having regular conversations, but back to my earlier comment, we still haven't been able to get that price point down to the low 200s or under $200,000 for your traditional 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 2-car garage. It's a big challenge right now, and from what we're hearing, it's not going to change probably much in the next 3 to 6 months. Hopefully, we're wrong on that. But that's what we're seeing right now. It's a major challenge.
It is, and it's one that I know we're struggling with across greater Minnesota. So we appreciate your insights on that. So, as we're wrapping up here, Chad, if you were governor, if you were the chair of a housing committee, and you were putting together an omnibus bill or a proposal, what would you look at as the tools or the investments that we need to solve Greater Minnesota's housing challenge?
I think some that we see and hear directly are, again, the housing infrastructure bonds have to be amply supported. We're proposing $500 million through the Homes for All Coalition. That includes also general obligation bonds for public housing as well too. That's a significant dollar figure, considering that we got $100 million here just recently. The workforce housing program, where there's policy changes, but I think more specifically, if there's a funding formula change with that program, there would be dozens and dozens of communities applying for that. There's just a few barriers right now where the grant itself sometimes does not cover the increased cost of prevailing wage, unfortunately. So there's got to be creative ways to kind of go about that in communities to kind of work through that. We're also an advocate of what's referred to as a 4D tax rate change, which would change the tax rate on affordable housing properties from 0.75% down to 0.25%, which would save a lot of property owners substantial dollars that they can then reinvest into those facilities for long-term preservation, or to reinvest into new product in the future.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those comments, Chad. Any last comments that you want to share before we wrap things up here?
I don't have anything else, but feel welcome to reach out to me. I'm not sure if you've got my email address, available there. If you want me to just kind of list that off, certainly I'm available to take calls and respond to emails as needed.
Great. Well, thank you. And for our participants today, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your interest and your passion on these issues. And we know that, all of our cities are struggling in one way or another with this housing issue. And, the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities and the Greater Minnesota Partnership will continue to be a voice of the capital on these issues. But I do encourage you all to take the time to reach out to your local legislators and have the conversations with them about what you're seeing in your community and what's going on. Often what we end up at the state in a lot of these conversations, especially around housing, is, a statewide conversation about the housing challenges. And as a result, it ends up being a statewide conversation through a Twin Cities metro lens. And so a lot of times the challenges that we are seeing on the ground in Greater Minnesota aren't always included in the discussion the way that they need to. And the reality is the housing challenges that we see in Greater Minnesota are different than the housing challenges that we see in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. As Chad indicated from his experience, the costs that cities have on development aren't the barrier that we're seeing. Whereas we hear frequently that the costs that we're seeing in the metro are a barrier to some of the development and some of that side. And so the more that you all can have conversations with your local legislators, the better we're going to have at having successful, productive conversations in the state capitol. So I encourage you to, take the opportunity from not only what you were able to learn from this conversation, but more conversations coming forward to take those conversations into your community and into your legislators so that we can, help all of us move things forward. So with that, Chad, thank you. Participants, thank you for your time. Stay tuned to future communications from the coalition and in briefs and whatnot coming up. We'll keep you posted as to what's going on. As I indicated, there is the bill up tomorrow in the Senate Housing Committee on that workforce development grant program. So feel free to tune in at 1 o'clock for that. We'll have more hearings as session goes on, but we appreciate all of your time today. And if there are any follow-up questions, feel free to contact either Chad or myself. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.